The morning of the trial dawned with a peculiar weight in the air, a stillness that permeated every corner of Courtroom 21A. It wasn't the usual quiet hum of legal anticipation. This was a suffocating silence, pregnant with an unspoken tension. Outside, the city throbbed with its relentless rhythm, but within these hallowed walls, time seemed to slow, condensing around a single, pivotal moment. Journalists, usually a cacophony of hushed conversations and rustling papers, stooped in their assigned seats, their pens poised, their faces etched with a mixture of fatigue and fervent expectation. Attorneys murmured tactics, their voices barely audible, like conspirators in a drama far grander than themselves. The air was thick with expectation, a palpable pressure that seemed to squeeze the very breath from one's lungs. Sean "Diddy" Combs, a name synonymous with empire, a titan of the music industry whose influence stretched across continents and defined generations, sat at the defense table. His posture, typically one of almost arrogant confidence, was now stiff, rigid. The usual bravado, the easy charm, the knowing smiles exchanged with his legal team, all had vanished, replaced by a carefully constructed mask. But even that mask, meticulously crafted over decades of public scrutiny and private battles, seemed brittle, threatening to crack under the immense pressure of the moment. He ran a hand over his impeccably tailored suit, a gesture barely perceptible yet revealing. A faint tremor, almost imperceptible to the casual observer, passed through his fingers as he reached for a glass of water, a telltale sign that beneath the veneer of composure, a storm was brewing. On this day, as the massive, unforgiving doors of the courthouse swung open for what would be the most pivotal, perhaps the most devastating testimony of his illustrious yet troubled life, even that formidable mask began to crack. Because what was about to unfold wasn't a calculated legal maneuver, or a surprise witness pulled from the shadows of his contentious past. It was far more intimate, far more devastating. It was his mother. At 83 years old, Janice Commies entered the courtroom not with a flourish, but with a quiet, deliberate, almost regal grace. Her slender frame, though aged, held itself with an inner strength that belied her years. Her cane, a silent companion, tapped a slow, rhythmic cadence against the polished marble floor, each tap resonating like a solemn drumbeat in the sudden, profound quiet that enveloped the room. Every single eye in the packed federal courthouse in Manhattan, from the stern-faced judge on his elevated bench to the furiously scribbling journalists whose pens had suddenly frozen mid-stroke, locked onto her. The bailiffs, usually a picture of detached authority, stood a little straighter, their expressions betraying a flicker of surprise. A collective gasp, sharp and audible, rippled through the gallery. A sound like a sudden intake of breath from 100 stunned lungs. A wave of pure disbelief washing over the assembled crowd. Not even the most seasoned courtroom observers, those who had witnessed countless twists and turns in high-profile cases, had anticipated this. Not even Diddy himself, the man who had faced down allegations for decades, who had built an empire on defiance and unwavering self-belief, who had smiled for the cameras and whispered confidently with his legal team as if impervious to the storm around him. This man seemed to shrink in his seat. The color, moments ago a healthy flush, drained from his face, leaving behind a pallor that spoke volumes of a sudden, internal collapse. His lawyers, usually a picture of calm confidence, exchanged quick, worried glances, their whispered strategies momentarily forgotten, their carefully prepared notes suddenly irrelevant. The prosecution, until then a picture of quiet resolve, their faces neutral, now straightened, their collective posture radiating an almost predatory anticipation. A silent acknowledgement that the tide had just turned, irrevocably. Everything was about to change. As Janice Commies, the woman who had nurtured Sean Combs from a boy into a global icon, raised her right hand, her grip firm despite her age, an almost sacred hush fell over the courtroom. It was a silence so absolute, it felt as though the very air had been sucked out of the room, leaving behind a vacuum of raw, unadulterated tension. This wasn't hearsay. It wasn't the testimony of disgruntled former associates or jilted lovers seeking revenge or financial gain. This was the voice of a mother, preparing to speak under oath about the son she had raised, celebrated, and ultimately come to fear. Her unwavering gaze swept across the courtroom, meeting no one's eye directly, yet somehow acknowledging everyone, before settling with a quiet resolve on the prosecutor. The silence was so profound, so absolute, you could almost hear the thoughts colliding in Diddy's mind. The meticulous planning, the years of carefully constructed image, the layers of insulation he had built around himself, all threatened to collapse under the weight of this single, unexpected presence. Was it the sudden, jarring sight of his strongest advocate, his anchor, his unyielding protector, now positioned as a witness for the prosecution? Was it the whispered rumors that had reached his ears, the chilling prospect of his closest friends turning state's evidence, betraying their loyalty? Or was it, perhaps, the most terrifying realization of all, that his meticulously crafted defense, a fortress built on denial, deflection, and the power of his public persona, was about to crumble from within, undermined not by an enemy, but by the very foundation of his life? Whatever the catalyst, the carefully constructed facade of Sean Combs, the invincible mogul, dissolved in that moment, revealing simply a son. A son watching his mother prepare to tell the truth, a truth that promised to redefine everything he thought he controlled. The prosecutor's opening and the mother's resolve. Mrs. Commies, thank you for being here today. I understand how difficult this must be. Janice Commies nodded subtly, a gesture of quiet acknowledgement, her extraordinary serenity in the face of such a momentous and deeply personal situation on full display. The whole trial, until this very second, had followed a predictable trajectory of legal maneuvers, counter-arguments, and carefully vetted testimonies. But the moment the judge gave his consent for her to proceed, a seismic shift occurred. Why? Because the words Janice Commies was about to utter did not belong to any predetermined media storyline. They weren't hearsay from disgruntled former employees, or veiled accusations from people who had worked with or been associated with his company before. This was her story. She had reared him, rejoiced in his triumphs, and protected him from detractors for decades. This was a narrative drawn from a lifetime of intimate observation. Diddy's lawyer, recognizing the devastating potential of such testimony, quickly raised the privilege of family contacts as an objection. His voice, usually booming with conviction, held a note of desperation. But the prosecution swiftly countered, arguing that conversations between a mother and her adult son are not protected by any legal privilege, especially if they deal with allegations of wrongdoing. After a brief aside, a hushed conference between the judge and the legal teams, the court dismissed the objection. The judge, his brow furrowed, told Mrs. Commies to go on. No one spoke a word in the courtroom. The reporters, their fingers poised over keyboards, had ceased pressing any keys. Even the court sketch artists, their pencils precariously balanced above the page, had halted, unwilling to miss a single pivotal gesture. The prosecution staff kept their faces neutral, but Diddy's relatives in the gallery were visibly startled and perplexed, their earlier confidence replaced by an almost agonizing uncertainty. After adjusting her spectacles, a small, deliberate movement, Janice Commies fixed her gaze squarely on the prosecutor. Her voice, though soft, carried an undeniable power. I've been asked to testify about conversations I've had with my son over the years, and about behaviors I've witnessed that concerned me. I'm here because I believe the truth needs to be told, no matter how painful. Narrator. A low murmur, like the distant rustle of leaves, filled the courtroom, quickly suppressed by a stern look from the bailiff. Diddy himself, his face a mask of strained composure, pulled at his sleeve, a frantic, almost childish gesture, signaling his lead attorney to complain once again. It was as though he had mentally prepared himself to hear everything, to face every accusation, except for this one. Because of the witness's advanced age and the evident emotional toll her testimony was already taking, the prosecutor approached with great care, his voice gentle. Prosecutor, Mrs. Commies, could you please tell the court about your relationship with your son? Despite the immense gravity of the situation, Janice Commies drew a deep, fortifying breath. The courtroom waited. The statements that followed would not merely influence, They would irrevocably alter one of the most high-profile criminal trials in recent history. The genesis of concern. A mother's love and growing unease. I raised Sean as a single mother after his father was murdered when he was just a child. I worked multiple jobs, sometimes 2 or 3 at once, to provide for him, to give him opportunities one never had. I wanted him to be strong, to be successful, to make something of himself, to realize every potential within him. And he did that. He exceeded every dream I had for him, every aspiration I ever held for my son. As she spoke, she reminisced about the initial, unadulterated joy she had witnessed in her son's meteoric climb. From an ambitious intern, he transformed into a formidable music executive, a visionary producer, a captivating performer, an astute entrepreneur, and finally, a multimillionaire, a name that echoed across the globe. As she thought back on his youthful spirit of adventure and resolve, the sheer force of his ambition, her expression became gentler, almost wistful. According to her, Sean was always charismatic, always a natural leader. Even as a boy, she recalled, he possessed an uncanny ability to convince anyone of anything. He had that gift, she added, her expression gradually lightening to a slight, almost bittersweet grin, a ghost of her former pride. She tilted her head slightly towards the jurors, as if seeking their understanding. But somewhere along the way, she continued, her voice gaining a new, somber tone, the slight smile fading, something changed, the shifting sands of power and the cracks in the facade. Success came so fast, so completely, so overwhelmingly. It was like a tidal wave. Suddenly, everyone around him was saying yes to him. Everyone wanted something from him, a piece of his magic, a share of his influence. Everyone treated him like he was above the rules that applied to ordinary people, the very fabric of decency and law that governed everyone else. And I started to see him believe it. I started to see that exceptionalism become ingrained in his very being. The prosecutor, with a tender and empathetic demeanor, gently led her through her memories, guiding her back to Diddy's heyday in the early 2000s, a period of unparalleled public triumph that seemed to mask a growing darkness. Janice Commies detailed the concerning trends in her son's behavior that she began to notice, subtle at first, then increasingly undeniable. His growing dominance over others, not merely as a leader, but as an almost tyrannical force. His explosive outbursts of fury when pushed, when his will was even slightly questioned, revealing a volatile core, and a casual disrespect for personal space, for boundaries, for the very autonomy of others, that gradually escalated from a mere quirk to something far more sinister. I blamed the pressure at first, she said, her voice tinged with a mother's earnest attempt to rationalize. The entertainment industry can be brutal, a relentless machine that grinds people down, and he was handling so much responsibility, so much expectation. But then I started hearing things, seeing things. When I visited his homes, young women who seemed disoriented, almost dazed, moving through the opulent spaces like ghosts. Staff who appeared afraid of him, their eyes darting away when he entered a room, their movements furtive. And rooms I wasn't allowed to enter, places shrouded in an unexplained secrecy. She paused, her gaze distant, recalling a specific memory. Among his 2008 visits to his Miami home, one jumped out. I arrived unannounced. She spoke up, a faint, almost nervous laugh rippling through a few members of the audience. Mothers can do that. There had been a party the night before, a blur of lights and music, now only a faint, lingering scent of alcohol and perfume. When I walked in, she continued, her voice hushed, there were staff cleaning up, but they seemed different. It wasn't the normal after-party cleanup. They were collecting phones from various rooms, almost frantically. One young woman was crying silently, while a security guard escorted her out. She hadn't contacted him beforehand, and Sean was enraged when he saw her. He had an anger in his eyes I hadn't seen directed at a guest before. The prosecutor then showed Mrs. Commies a photograph, a stark, almost clinical image. Do you recognize this location? With a deliberate nod, she studied it, her face etched with a familiar pain. This is the pool house at Sean's Los Angeles home. He converted it into what he called a studio around 2010. But he was very secretive about it. I wasn't allowed inside, which struck me as odd. I had always been welcome everywhere in his homes before that. I could walk into any room, anytime. Not this one. She went on to talk about how her worries progressed, a slow, agonizing escalation, and how she attempted to talk to her son about them, to appeal to the boy she still remembered. Then she spoke with more conviction, her voice firm. Mothers do that too. I had asked inquiries, probing questions, but he would dismiss me. He would tell me I didn't understand how things worked in his world, that everything was consensual, that it was just the lifestyle of the music industry. He always had an answer, always a justification. The first public accusations and the cracks of doubt. The prosecutor then honed in on particular discussions, the shift from private observations to public allegations. Did your son ever discuss with you allegations made against him by women? A slow, heavy nod was given by Janice Commies. Janice Commies. Yes, when the first accusations began surfacing publicly, around 2017, I called him immediately. Any mother would. I asked him directly if there was any truth to them. He told me they were lying, that they wanted money, that this happened to all successful men in the industry. It was the price of fame. With a clear sign of exhaustion, a deep sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years, she halted. I believed him. I wanted to believe him. He was my son, my only child. How could I not? The prosecution's questions were gentle, almost solicitous. And did something happen to change that belief? Her response was a subtle, almost imperceptible yes, as her voice grew softer, tinged with a profound sadness. Her gaze drifted briefly to her son, then quickly away, as if unable to bear the weight of his presence. Janice Commies. In late 2023, after Cassie filed her lawsuit, I confronted him again. This time, I knew I needed more than his usual dismissals. We were alone in his apartment in New York. The city sounds were muffled, and the silence between us was deafening. I told him I needed to hear the truth, the unvarnished truth, not what his lawyers were telling him to say, not what he was telling the public, not another carefully crafted spin. Just the truth, raw and honest, between a mother and son. A truth that only he could give me, and only I, as his mother, could truly receive. As she proceeded, her voice gaining a quiet, formidable power, the entire courtroom fell into complete, suffocating stillness. Every breath held, every movement frozen. He was quiet for a long time, longer than I had ever known him to be. He didn't pace. He didn't argue. He just sat there. Then he spoke, and he said something I'll never forget. Something that confirmed every fear I had harbored in my heart for years. He said, "Mom, you don't build what I've built by playing by everyone else's rules. Sometimes people get hurt. That's business. That's not how I raised him. That's not business. That's not right. That's not the son I gave my life to." Diddy remained quite still during the whole testimony, his gaze fixed on the table, seemingly beyond his own immediate surroundings. The lawyers representing him scrolled notes hastily, their pens scratching furiously, occasionally leaning in to mutter under their breath, their faces a mixture of concern and growing alarm. As if engrossed on the truth of his mother's words, on the very fabric of his existence, Diddy appeared to be beyond their grasp, lost in a world only he and his mother understood. Janice Commies went on to explain how her worries became more pressing, more agonizing, in early 2024, with the emergence of the shocking CCTV footage showing Diddy physically assaulting Cassie in a hotel corridor. The video, replayed endlessly across news channels and social media, had been a punch to the gut for the world, but for a mother, it was a visceral, soul-crushing blow. I called him immediately after seeing that video. Devastated doesn't begin to describe it. It was like seeing a stranger, but knowing it was my son. I asked him how he could do such a thing, how the boy I raised could be capable of such an act. He told me it was a difficult time in their relationship, that I was only seeing one moment out of context, a snapshot that didn't define him. He said he wasn't that person anymore. The prosecutor inquired, his voice soft, almost hesitant. "Did you believe him?" Janice Commies, her voice firm, devoid of hesitation. "No. Not anymore." Because I had seen glimpses of that rage myself over the years, never directed at me, thank God, but at staff, at business associates. A sudden, terrifying flare-up, a casual cruelty that would pass quickly, but leave a cold dread in its wake. The Sean in that video wasn't a stranger to me, not entirely. And that realization, that horrifying confirmation of my deepest fears, broke my heart. It shattered the last illusion I held onto about him. She went on to say that the more she testified, the more she realized that the accusations against her son were too constant, too pervasive, to be dismissed as mere fabrications or opportunism. There was a pattern, a chilling consistency that transcended individual stories. Her memory, sharpened by pain and conviction, brought forth another disturbing detail. During a visit to his home office in early 2024, she found something that deeply unsettled her. Lists of women's names, with stark, almost clinical comments like "handled" and "potential problem" scrawled next to them. A cold, bureaucratic ledger of human lives. When I asked him about it, he snatched the paper from my hands. He told me it was business, nothing for me to worry about. He dismissed my concerns with a wave of his hand, as if I were a child. But the look in his eyes, I knew. As a mother, you know when your child is hiding something, even when they're grown, even when they're a powerful man. You know the truth in their silence, in their evasions. Bringing forth yet another exhibit, the prosecutor advanced, placing a document before her. "Mrs. Commies, I'm showing you what has been marked as Government Exhibit 42. Do you recognize this document?" Her deliberate nod indicated her careful examination of the page, her gaze steady. "Yes, these are notes I began keeping. After that conversation, after seeing those lists, I started writing down things I had witnessed over the years, conversations we'd had, behaviors that concerned me. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The denials were no longer enough. My heart, my conscience, wouldn't allow it." "And why did you begin keeping these notes?" the prosecutor asked, his voice gentle, guiding her through the emotional landscape of her decision. "Because I was afraid. I was afraid I was losing perspective, that my fierce love for my son was clouding my judgment, distorting my perception of reality. Writing it all down, seeing it in black and white, helped me see the pattern more clearly, helped me connect the dots of a story I had long tried to deny. And what I saw terrified me. It was a pattern of behavior that was undeniably dark, undeniably destructive." Janice Commies' determination was plain to see when she shifted her attention back to the prosecutor. Her gaze firm, her resolve absolute. "I love my son. That will never change. A mother's love is unconditional. But I cannot pretend anymore. I cannot be silent anymore. Not when too many people have been hurt. Not when the truth demands to be spoken." The prosecutor, taking into account the witness's evident emotional condition, approached her carefully, his voice respectful. "Mrs. Commies, I want to ask you about a specific conversation you had with your son in April of this year, after his arrest, but before this trial began. Can you tell the court about that conversation?" As if getting ready for the most challenging, most agonizing portion of her testimony, Janice Commies adjusted herself in her chair, taking another deep breath, bracing herself for the final, brutal truth. "Yes, I visited Sean at the detention center. It was just the two of us in a private room. They made special arrangements because of who he is, because of his public stature. I told him that I needed to hear the truth, all of it, every ugly detail, before I could continue supporting him publicly, before I could look myself in the mirror. I said, 'Sean, I'm your mother. I love you unconditionally, but I need to know what I'm standing behind, what I'm fighting for, what I'm defending.'" As she related his reply, the entire courtroom fell into complete, deafening stillness. The air itself seemed to crackle with anticipation. Every ear strained to catch her every word. He was quiet for a long time. The silence in that small room was crushing. Then he spoke. He said, "The truth, Ma, the truth is I created a world where I made the rules, where what I wanted happened. where people either played along or got pushed aside, disappeared. Where my word was law. Her voice wavered, but she pushed through. Was it always right? No. Did people get hurt? Yes, but that's how power works, Ma. That's how it's always worked. That's how the game is played. She waited for a while, gathering her thoughts, allowing the weight of his confession to settle, not just on the courtroom, but on her own soul before continuing. I asked him about the specific allegations, the parties, the recordings, the drugs, the threats. I needed to hear him deny it if it wasn't true. I needed one last chance to cling to the hope that he was innocent, that this was all a terrible misunderstanding. And did he deny it? The prosecutor asked, his voice barely a whisper, yet resonating throughout the quiet room. Janice Commies, her response straightforward, devoid of emotion, yet carrying immense weight. No. He said, it's complicated. Everything was consensual at the beginning. Nobody was forced. But once you're in that world, the lines get blurred. The boundaries vanish. Sometimes people change their minds later, but by then they'd already taken the money, the opportunities, the access. They'd already benefited. They were already part of my world. Even as she went on, Janice Commies' hands quivered a little, betraying the immense internal struggle, the shattering of a lifetime of maternal belief. I told him that consent obtained through pressure, through fear of consequences, through intoxication, that isn't real consent. That isn't humanity. To which he simply replied with a chilling detachment, that's not how it works in my world. My world operates on different rules. As time went on, Diddy's lawyers at the defense table looked more and more worried, their whispers becoming more agitated. Diddy, however, turned his attention back to his mother, his gaze unwavering, as his lead attorney penned a frantic message and shoved it in his direction, a silent plea for him to respond. The prosecutor, sensing the profound impact of the moment, applied little pressure. Did your son ever explicitly admit to the criminal conduct he's charged with? Janice Commies, her gaze fixing squarely on the jurors, a silent plea for them to understand the agonizing truth she was revealing, not in those words. Not directly, but he told me enough for me to understand the truth. He said, the system I built worked for years. Everyone got what they wanted. It only became a problem when people decided to change the rules, when they decided to not play along anymore. I raised my son to take responsibility for his actions, to be accountable, to possess a moral compass. When he told me that, when he uttered those words, I knew he had lost his way. He wasn't seeing people as people anymore, with their own rights and their own dignity. He was seeing them just as pieces in a game he believed he controlled, disposable pawns in his grand design. In it, she conveyed her love for him without restriction, without question. But she was also very disappointed, her words imbued with a mother's heartbreaking anguish, and she refused to justify his actions, which she now saw as undeniably harmful and profoundly wrong. Prosecutor, did you receive a response to this letter? Janice Commies, yes, she responded, her voice trembling slightly. Sean called me. He was angry at first, his voice laced with indignation, then almost pleading. He said I didn't understand what was at stake, that his whole life, everything he'd built, every empire he'd forged, was on the line. I told him that was precisely why I had to speak the truth, because lives were at stake. Not only his, the lives of others, the lives of the women he had impacted, their pain, their truth. Then the prosecutor wanted to know why she, his own mother, had made the almost unthinkable decision to testify. Prosecutor, Mrs. Commies, what brought you here today? Why did you agree to testify in this case? A long, profound pause from Janice Commies, a moment of deep introspection, as if gathering the immense emotional fortitude required for her final, powerful declaration. Janice Commies, her voice gaining strength, ringing with clarity and unwavering conviction, directed not just at the prosecutor, but at the entire courtroom, and most profoundly at her son, because the truth matters, because accountability matters, because I raised my son to be better than this, to be a man of integrity, not just power. And because I believe that true love, a mother's love, the kind of love that nurtures and protects, means wanting your child to face the consequences of their actions so they can become better, so they can learn, so they can truly grow. Not protecting them from those consequences and watching them become worse, watching them lose their soul. Janice Commies. I'm here because I love my son enough to tell the truth about him, even when that truth is painful beyond measure. I'm here because the women who were hurt deserve someone to stand up and acknowledge their pain, their suffering, their stolen dignity. And I'm here because Sean needs to understand that no amount of money, no amount of fame, no amount of power places you above basic human decency. No amount of success exempts you from the laws of morality and human respect. In that moment, something inside Sean Combs irrevocably broke. The music mogul, the titan of industry, the king of his own meticulously constructed world, became simply a son. A son, stripped bare, confronting the unbearable truth delivered by the woman who knew him best, the woman who had seen him from birth to his very unraveling. His carefully guarded self-assurance, the facade he had maintained since the trial began, since his empire first began to tremble, finally fell. The prosecutor thanked Mrs. Commies, her voice gentle, and she walked slowly back to her seat, her mission complete, her conscience clear, though her heart was heavy. During cross-examination, the defense counsel stood, his demeanor surprisingly mild-mannered, almost kind. Instead of trying to cast doubt on her credibility or imply that she had any hidden agendas, he concentrated on showing that her evidence was based on assumptions and discussions rather than actual observation of the claimed events. He aimed to frame her testimony as an emotional plea, not a factual account. Janice Commies maintained her composure throughout the cross-examination, recognizing the limitations of her testimony, but remaining steadfast in its essential, brutal truth, that her son had established and run a system that exploited and hurt others, and that he had basically confessed this to her in private talks. She hesitated, her gaze returning to her son, a final, lingering look as she was eventually removed from the witness stand. Despite the lack of spoken communication, the glance conveyed a mother's want for restitution for the hurt caused, as well as her profound disappointment and years of unwavering love. With her back straight and her dignity untarnished, she stepped carefully past the defense table and left the courtroom, her presence fading, but her words echoing. Diddy observed her departure, and his facial expressions revealed that of all the evidence presented throughout the trial, of all the witnesses, his mother's statements had had the most indelible impact on him. Nothing but the raw, unvarnished truth remained between a mother and her son once the masks were removed. Following Janice Commies' emotionally charged testimony, the prosecution sought to contextualize her unprecedented actions through the lens of psychological expertise. They called Dr. Margaret Chun, a renowned family psychology specialist who had worked extensively with cases involving prominent public personalities and complex family dynamics. Once her extensive credentials were established, painting a picture of deep knowledge and experience, the prosecutor requested that she clarify the profound relevance and psychological implications of the previous testimony. Dr. Margaret Chun, calm, analytical, but with a deep understanding of human emotion, what we saw today was absolutely remarkable. It is, frankly, almost unheard of. In high-profile cases involving wealthy or famous defendants, we often see family members either remaining adamantly silent, protecting the family's image at all costs, or providing unwavering, unequivocal support regardless of the mounting evidence. This is a common defense mechanism within high-stakes environments. For a mother to testify as Mrs. Commies did represents a profound, almost revolutionary break from that entrenched pattern. Dr. Chun leaned forward slightly, her voice emphasizing the significance of her analysis. From a psychological perspective, this suggests that Mrs. Commies reached what we call a moral tipping point. This is a moment, often gradual but intensely powerful, when the cognitive dissonance, the psychological discomfort of holding conflicting beliefs or values between her deep, inherent love for her son and her growing, undeniable recognition of the harm he has caused, became too great to sustain. The weight of her conscience, the sheer incompatibility of these two realities, reached a critical mass, forcing her to choose truth over loyalty, accountability over protection. The fact that she described a gradual awakening, a slow, agonizing realization rather than a sudden, revelatory moment, lent significant credibility to her testimony, Dr. Chun explained. Janice Commies had detailed a creeping pattern in which her son ignored her worries, dismissed her concerns, used his job as an excuse, and consistently acted as if the rules, the moral obligations that applied to ordinary people, simply didn't apply to him. The prosecution wanted to know more about these specific dynamics, the insidious nature of power and influence. These are classic manifestations of what we call power insulation. Individuals who accumulate extreme wealth, widespread fame, and immense influence often become surrounded by a protective bubble, a circle of people who reinforce their sense of exceptionalism, who cater to their every whim, and who, crucially, shield them from consequences. This environment creates a distorted reality, where dissenting voices are filtered out and problematic behaviors are normalized or justified. The individual becomes detached from the very human impact of their actions. She paused, her gaze thoughtful. A mother, however, is often the last person who can penetrate that insulation, because she knew the individual before the power, before the wealth, before the fame. She holds a unique memory of their foundational self, their innocence, their true character. That deep, pre-existing bond gives her a rare, albeit painful, access to their inner world. She went into detail about how Diddy's supposedly candid admissions to his mom, his statements about building a world where he made the rules, where people got hurt because that's business, showed a perspective molded by decades of his actions being accepted, justified, and unchallenged. The insulation had become so complete that his moral compass had not merely drifted, but had been entirely reoriented. He saw human beings not as individuals deserving of respect, but as elements in his self-serving system. This kind of testimony, especially from a primary caregiver, serves a critical purpose beyond just providing evidence. It holds a mirror up to the defendant, reflecting a truth that few others have the courage or the proximity to express. It underscores the profound psychological cost of living in such an insulated reality, where the lines between right and wrong become so profoundly blurred that doing business becomes a euphemism for human exploitation. Mrs. Commies' testimony was not just about what her son did, but what he became, and the heartbreaking realization of that transformation through a mother's eyes. The courtroom stood adjourned, the doors of justice temporarily closed, but the powerful, poignant echoes of Janice Commies' words lingered, vibrating in the very foundations of the building. Her testimony was a devastating testament to a mother's fractured love, a love so profound it compelled her to speak an unbearable truth. It was a stark reminder of the brutal cost of unchecked power, the insidious nature of fame, and the chilling ease with which human decency can be eroded when accountability is absent. The trial of Sean Diddy Combs had shifted irrevocably, transformed not by legal cunning or dramatic revelations from anonymous sources, but by the unwavering, heartbreaking truth delivered by the woman who brought him into the world. In the silent aftermath, her voice remained, a haunting and unforgettable testament to the enduring human need for justice and the ultimate, undeniable truth that, in the end, no amount of money, fame, or power can ever truly place one above basic human decency.